I gave up my dead mother's foster son, and I'm finally ready to talk about it. First, a little about me. I'm 30, live in a smallish town in upstate New York, and I work in IT. Nothing too exciting. Mostly remote work, fixing other people's tech problems, and pretending I understand what half the acronyms my coworkers use mean. I'm pretty introverted, but I've always considered myself close to my family. My mom especially, she was one of those people who seemed to have endless energy for everyone else. She was a foster parent for 11 years, and she was amazing at it. Like truly amazing. I don't know how she did it, but she somehow managed to give every kid who came through our home the love and stability they needed, even if it was just for a little while. Growing up, I was kind of her unofficial sidekick. I helped out where I could, driving kids to appointments, helping with homework, that sort of thing. I was never in the thick of it, though. She handled the hard stuff, especially when it came to the more challenging kids. And then, 2 years ago, she got sick. Stage 4 cancer. It was fast, too fast. Before she passed, she told me she was counting on me to keep things going, to take care of the 2 boys living with us at the time. John, who was 19, and Paul, who was 16. I said yes, of course. What else could I say? She was my mom, and honestly, I wanted to be there for the boys. John and I had always been close. He's one of those genuinely good people who somehow keeps smiling no matter how much life throws at him. Paul was different. He has severe developmental and behavioral challenges. He's nonverbal most of the time, though he has these moments where he'll say something completely out of the blue, and it always catches me off guard. He needs a lot of structure, a lot of patience, and a lot of care, things my mom had in spades, but I wasn't sure I could give. Still, I figured I'd manage. I mean, how hard could it be? For the first few weeks after Mom passed, I was basically running on autopilot. I kept telling myself I just needed to get through one day at a time. But even then, there were signs I was in over my head. Paul's meltdowns became more frequent, sometimes over things I couldn't even figure out. He'd lash out, hitting walls or throwing things, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't seem to calm him down the way my mom could. John tried to help, but he was juggling work and school, and honestly, he was dealing with his own grief. I could tell he was trying to be strong for me, but I think we both knew I was barely holding it together. Still, I kept pushing forward, partly because I didn't want to let my mom down, but mostly because I didn't know what else to do. Paul's needs were a lot. I mean, I always knew they were. I saw it growing up, watching my mom care for him. But knowing something and living it are 2 totally different things. He needed constant supervision. I couldn't leave him alone for more than a few minutes without worrying he'd hurt himself or destroy something. And when he'd have meltdowns, they were unpredictable and intense. One time, I accidentally gave him the wrong color plate at dinner, blue instead of green, and he threw the entire plate, food and all, across the kitchen. I tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. He just screamed and banged his fists on the table until he wore himself out. I felt like I was failing him. I kept thinking Mom would have known what to do. She would have handled this. But I wasn't her. John was a huge help, but he wasn't around all the time. He had a job at a local grocery store and was taking night classes at the community college, so most of the day-to-day stuff with Paul fell on me. And honestly, I could tell it was wearing on John too. He'd come home exhausted, and I felt guilty even asking him to step in when I was at my breaking point. And yeah, I'll be real here. I hit my breaking point more than once. There was one night about 2 months in that sticks out in my mind. It had been a long day. Paul had refused to get out of bed that morning, then refused to eat lunch, then had a full-blown meltdown when I suggested we go for a walk to get some fresh air. By the time dinner rolled around, I was already running on fumes. I made spaghetti. It's one of the few things Paul would reliably eat, and I was just trying to get through the evening without another incident. But, of course, the universe had other plans. Paul decided he didn't want spaghetti that night. He took one look at his plate, shoved it onto the floor, and started screaming. And not just regular screaming. This was the kind that rips through your skull and makes your brain feel like it's about to short-circuit. I tried to stay calm. I really did. I told him it was okay, that I'd make him something else, but he just kept screaming. Then he started hitting himself, which always freaks me out. I tried to stop him, but he started swinging at me instead. And that's when I lost it. I didn't yell at him or anything. I wasn't that far gone, but I just froze. I sat down on the floor, right there in the middle of the mess, and I started crying. Like ugly crying. The kind where you can't even catch your breath. John came home in the middle of all this. He walked into the kitchen, took one look at me sobbing on the floor, and Paul still screaming his head off, and just said, "Okay, you need a break." He took over with Paul, got him calmed down somehow. Honestly, I don't even know how he did it, and then sat me down afterward. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," he said. And he was right. I couldn't. But what was I supposed to do? This was my responsibility now. I promised my mom I'd take care of Paul until he turned 18. That was the deal. But the thing is, promises don't mean much if you're too broken to keep them. I started looking into resources the next day, calling social workers, researching respite care, trying to figure out what options were out there. It felt like admitting defeat, and I hated it. But I also knew that if I didn't do something, I was going to burn out completely. And what good would I be to Paul, or John, for that matter, if I let that happen? The process of reaching out for help was slow and frustrating. But eventually, I got in touch with a caseworker who specialized in finding placements for kids with special needs. She was kind and understanding, which honestly made me feel even guiltier. Like, I kept expecting her to judge me, but instead, she just said, "You're doing the right thing by asking for help." I wasn't sure I believed her, but I needed to hear it anyway. So, once I started working with a caseworker, things moved faster than I expected. Not fast into "this was easy" sense, more like fast into "oh my God, this is really happening, and I'm not ready" sense. The caseworker, her name was Lisa, explained that finding a specialized placement for Paul wasn't going to be simple. Kids with his level of needs require very specific environments, trained caregivers, structured routines, and a lot of one-on-one attention. The kind of setup that, frankly, I just couldn't provide. Lisa assured me that these placements were designed to help kids like Paul thrive, but it still felt like a betrayal. Like I was saying, "I can't handle you anymore. Someone else can do better." We talked to Paul's therapist, his school, and a whole team of people who'd worked with him over the years. Everyone seemed to agree that this was the right move, but it didn't make it any easier. I kept thinking about my mom and how she'd managed to care for him all those years. I wondered if she'd be disappointed in me, or worse, if she'd be angry. The day we told Paul about the move was brutal. I don't even know how much he understood. I mean, cognitively, he's about 5 or 6 years old, so explaining something like this to him was tricky. Lisa came over to help, and we kept it simple. "You're going to live with a new family soon. They're really excited to meet you, and they'll take great care of you." Paul didn't react at first. He just stared at the floor, tapping his fingers against his leg like he does when he's processing something. But later that night, he had one of the worst meltdowns I've ever seen. He tore apart his room, like ripped the sheets off his bed, threw his toys everywhere, even broke a lamp. I tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. He wouldn't let me near him. Eventually, John came in and just sat on the floor outside Paul's room, talking to him through the door. He didn't say anything profound, just stuff like, "It's okay, buddy. We're here. We love you." But somehow it helped. Paul settled down after a while, and John stayed with him until he fell asleep. I'll never forget the look on John's face when he came out of that room. He looked so tired, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "This is the right thing," he said. "It sucks, but it's the right thing." The day Paul moved out was even harder. Lisa came to pick him up, and I helped pack his things. His favorite stuffed animals, his sensory toys, the green plate he insisted on using at every meal. I tried to stay upbeat, telling him about all the cool stuff waiting for him at his new home. A big backyard, a trampoline, a caregiver who'd worked with kids like him for over 20 years. But when it came time to say goodbye, I completely lost it. I hugged him, even though he doesn't usually like hugs, and to my surprise, he hugged me back. Just for a second. Then he pulled away, climbed into Lisa's car, and didn't look back. I stood in the driveway long after they drove off, feeling like the worst person on the planet. John came outside and put a hand on my shoulder. "He's going to be okay," he said. "And so are you." I wasn't so sure. After Paul left, I had no idea what to do with myself. The house felt eerily quiet, like I could hear every creak and groan it made. For the first time in years, I didn't have to be hyper-aware of someone else's needs 24/7. I didn't have to worry about meltdowns or routines or whether Paul had wandered off somewhere. And honestly, that scared me more than anything. At first, I tried to fill the void with busy work. I cleaned the house top to bottom, organized every closet, and even tackled the garage, which had basically been a dumping ground for random junk since I was a kid. But no matter how much I kept myself occupied, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd failed. John, being the annoyingly perceptive guy he is, noticed. One night, we were sitting on the couch watching some terrible reality show he loves, and he just turned to me and said, "You know you don't have to punish yourself for this, right?" I tried to brush him off, but he wouldn't let it go. "You did what was best for Paul. That doesn't mean you didn't love him. It just means you loved him enough to let him go." I didn't say anything at the time, but his words stuck with me. I started going to therapy regularly after that. My therapist, Karen, yes, her name is Karen, but she's one of the good Karens, helped me see that the guilt I was carrying wasn't just about Paul. It was also about my mom. I'd been holding myself to this impossible standard, trying to live up to the person she was, and every time I fell short, I felt like I was letting her down. Karen asked me something one session that really hit me. "If your mom were here right now, what do you think she'd say to you?" I thought about it for a long time. And you know what? I realized she'd probably tell me she was proud of me, that she understood how hard I'd tried, and that it was okay to admit I couldn't do it all. That realization didn't erase the guilt, but it made it easier to bear. Around this time, I also started focusing more on my relationship with John. Without the constant chaos of caring for Paul, we actually had time to talk, to really talk. I learned things about him I hadn't known before, like how he secretly wants to be a teacher someday, or how he's been saving up to travel to Europe once he finishes school. We became a team in a way we hadn't been before. He even started calling me his house dad, which made me laugh but also kind of melted my heart. And then about 3 months after Paul left, I got a call from Lisa, the caseworker. She told me Paul was doing really well in his new home. His new caregivers had set up a routine for him, and he was thriving with it. He even had his own little garden where he could dig in the dirt and plant flowers, a sensory activity he absolutely loved. Hearing that was such a relief. I still missed him, of course, but knowing he was happy and cared for made it easier to let go of the guilt. Not long after that, Lisa reached out again to ask if I'd be willing to take in a couple of kids for short-term placements. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready to jump back into fostering, especially after everything that had happened with Paul. But Lisa assured me that these kids didn't have the same level of needs, and it would only be for a few months. So, I said yes. The first new placement was a brother and sister, ages 7 and 9. They'd been through a lot, more than any kid should ever have to deal with, but they were sweet and resilient in a way that caught me off guard. We spent a lot of time baking cookies, playing board games, and just being a family. It wasn't always easy, but it felt good to be able to give them a safe place to land, even if it was only temporary. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, John and I were sitting in the kitchen, and he said, "You're good at this, you know." "At what?" I asked. "At being a dad. Or a foster dad, I guess." I laughed, mostly because the idea of me being a dad still felt ridiculous. But deep down, I knew he was right. I wasn't perfect, and I'd made my fair share of mistakes, but I cared. And sometimes, that's enough. Since then, I've taken in a few more kids, mostly short-term placements, though I'm open to longer ones down the road. It's not always easy, and there are days when I still feel like I'm in way over my head. But I've learned to ask for help when I need it, and I've stopped trying to be my mom. I'm just me. And for now, that's enough.